I'm going to recap a little bit of what she said. So relative to Sonia, she's one of these people that I can say, I knew her when. I knew her when she was a graduate student at the University of Michigan. We actually tried to hire her at Michigan State. Our dean wouldn't give us a tenure line, and I always wonder if some of us don't go into becoming deans because we had a really rotten experience with the dean once in our life, and we were going to do it right this time. Of course, we were in Virginia at the same time, so she was an associate dean of Virginia Tech. I was at the state, Virginia itself, in Charlottesville. And really, now that we're in the same state, I'm looking at this past interaction with Sonia, and I'm really watching her to find out where she makes her next move. I'm not saying you're going to move anywhere, but if you do, could you make it Hawaii? Okay, so I can follow you to Hawaii. I think that's sort of the thing that I'm hoping for. Okay. So I have to admit, when I was invited to give this talk about infrastructure and do something related to blue, green, and gray infrastructure, I did initially struggle a little bit in thinking about what I might talk about. Much of my research, as you'll see with the screen, focuses on cities of the global south, in particular cities of sub-Saharan Africa, and a lot of my research has really been about living conditions and urban deprivation. So much of the precarity of urban dwellers in places like Nairobi or Lagos or other cities is really because of an enormous lag in gray infrastructure. So, there's not the good provision that we take for granted often in the United States. So what am I talking about? Drainage, sewers, potable water, electricity, safe and complete streets. Talking about that in this audience, I kind of imagine isn't going to be as sexy as talking about, bioswales or, green roofs, afforestation, networked park systems, wetland rehabilitation, and things like that. And I have to say, as I wrote that, I thought, I know I'm in a specialized audience when I can call a bioswale sexy, right? I mean, not everybody thinks they're as cool as I'm assuming a lot of you in the room certainly do. But I'm really sure, as I think about this topic, that the failure of the state, as well as the private sector, to provide much needed infrastructure, both in the United States, to be honest, and in the global south, really isn't going to go away. And so I think there's a real need for us to be innovative in thinking about how we think about infrastructure. And there's a real opportunity in this space of, say, blue-green infrastructure for communities in conjunction with landscape architects, designers, urban planners like us, and yes, even architects, to improve the urban condition through these kind of programs. So in approaching this topic, I've decided to organize it in the following manner. First, kind of to launch from my own research, I want to talk about planetary urbanization. That is, I want to talk about the fact that the dominant mode of human existence right now is urban. Now, in discussing our urban world, I'm going to talk a little bit about the motivations for urbanization and the type of urban environments that we're creating across the globe, the kind of places where people find themselves living. Now, I'm going to focus on Kenya for this. And part of the focus on Kenya is I lived there for 5.5 years. I lived in Uganda for another 4.5. It's sort of my second country, but it's also the country for which I have the best data set. So we're going to use the data set in this sort of argument. And I'm not going to argue that in talking about Kenya cities, it's going to be entirely representative of sub-Saharan Africa, because there are cities and countries that are doing much better in Kenya. So if you think of, say, Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, or Kigali in Rwanda, I think you'll see much better living conditions and infrastructure provision there. But there are places that are much worse. So if you think about the DRC, right, Democratic Republic of Congo, or even, to be honest, certain cities in a relatively affluent country, Nigeria. So after I go through that, I'm going to outline the challenge that climate change is presenting to make that pivot and how it links to infrastructure. I hope, as I move through this, to end on a positive note about the importance of potential landscape-level interventions that we generally think of as being around green infrastructure, and sort of think about what this might mean for the global south. So before I go on, I hope that you recognize the 3 cities that I have up here on the screen. I assume that you recognize the top left, so that's Cape Town. So Cape Town proper, not the townships, in all its glory. And I think it's fair to say, with some caveats, that this is a city comparable to most any place in the global north, right, in terms of housing, infrastructure, urban services. The bottom right shows the delta in Lagos, Nigeria. And so those are slum settlements that literally are being built upon water. And the top right is the city, of course, that I know the most, which is Nairobi, Kenya. And this really shows a longstanding trend of the city, which I think in some ways is the antithesis of what we want to see with green infrastructure, which is the growth of the city and its continuous nibbling away at Nairobi National Park. So what you're seeing there, I think are the rear ends, maybe the front, of a couple zebras. Okay, so that's Nairobi National Park. So as many of you know, in 2010, the United Nations Population Division, which is the division that has to do all the forecasting about how the world is changing, announced that the Earth had arrived at a new era, a new epoch, right? The globe was no longer a rural place, it was now majority urban. And that means that more than 50% of the world's population was now living in cities or urban agglomerations. So in the academy, we often speak about the Anthropocene, right? So this unofficial unit of geologic time that describes that humans are basically starting to have a significant impact on the planet's climate and ecosystems. Amongst my peers in sort of the urban realm, we kind of think of it as synonymous with the Urbanocene, right? With urbanization being the dominant form of how humans are living and thus affecting the environment as well. So to put urbanization in context, in 1970, 1.3 billion people were in urban agglomerations. In 2014, 3.6 billion were in urban agglomerations. And in 2022, the figure is 4.5 billion people. And today, weirdly, I saw this slide yesterday at the UN, today is the day that the UN has announced that we're reaching 8 billion people. So pretty fascinating figure to have put out there. So what I want you to really understand is that this urbanization, this urban globe, urban Earth that we have, isn't the result of urbanization in North America, Europe, or even Latin America. We're already in cities, right? In the United States, we've been an urban society since the 1920s. Rather, this urban world has really come about due to massive population shifts that we've been seeing in the global south, most iconically, right, Asia. And so we can all probably bring to mind when you say that sort of the massive growth of Chinese cities, the incredible investment in infrastructure that they have done, and how it has facilitated the extraordinary growth of the Chinese economy. But what I want to let you know is that the urban transformation is actually most acute and most, in some ways, troublesome and challenging in Africa. Africa is the continent upon which the most rapid and unheralded urban transformation is taking place. In the last 50 years, the urban share of the African population has doubled, rising from 19% of the population to 39%. Urban growth is expected to continue unabated, and we expect that by 2030, another 360 million people will soon be living in African cities. So Africa today is actually more urban than India. I mean, India has a vast rural society. We think that the continent is going to reach majority urban, so 50% majority, by 2035. What I have you, so this is South Africa, by the way, in case you're wondering what the photo is. This probably is going to be hard to see, but just a few figures to kind of illustrate the growth. So Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, Tanzanian capital, was 3.4 million people in 2010. In 2025, they think it's going to be 6.2 million people. Nairobi, Kenya, 2010. 3.5 million, 2025, just a couple years away, 6.3 million people. And finally, a mega city that many of us probably can't conceptualize or often don't think about, Kinshasa in the DRC, 8.7 million in 2010, so already a very large city, but 15 million in 2025. So big cities and cities that are largely growing without infrastructure. So when you think about the implications of this, you might say, well, so what? We're now urban, what's it matter? Well, many analysts see this planetary urbanization as a negative development. They even are sort of apocalyptic, depending on who you read. For some, urbanization is seen as a real threat, right? Because there's this homogenization of culture, and that cities will become, everywhere you go, you'll see a McDonald's, right? There's a monoculture that might be out there. Others, like the late Mike Davis, if you've ever read of him, worry about chaotic, unplanned cities growing, particularly in the global south, and he has a very famous book where he warned about the planet of slums. Urban geographers, you must have a geography department here for sure, right? We don't have one at Georgia Tech. They like to think about systems of cities, right? And they worry that these really large cities will become ungovernable, right? That socially, environmentally, economically, they're going to become just too big to really manage. So these are the mega cities, right? Cities over 10 million in population. The CIA has even been writing about cities and worrying about them. It's turned its eyes to cities and it views them negatively as potentially sort of seething centers of ethnic conflict and possible violence. They're really worried that cities will spawn jihadists and other threats to global stability. And urban warfare, they warn, is actually going to be our future. So what we saw, not so much in Ukraine, but we've definitely seen in Syria, right? The urban warfare of the cities of Homs, Aleppo, and Damascus, that might be the sort of future form of warfare that we see. But of course, I'm an urbanist. I'm pro-urban, so I want to say, okay, enough apocalyptic language. Urbanism done right can have a really powerful upside, right? We all know that urban dwellers consume less space and stuff, right? They use less energy. We're far more likely to walk to work. We emit less carbon. So if you want to be sustainable and feel virtuous, which I always like to feel virtuous about my environmental footprint, it's far better to live in New York City or Midtown Atlanta, right, and walk to work than in Roswell or Alpharetta. I'm sorry if anyone comes from Roswell or Alpharetta. I had to pick on somebody, right? But what I have to say is that the people who are flocking to the cities in the global south aren't doing it because they want to be sustainable, because they want to walk and bike. They want to go there because these are places of opportunity, right? These are places where they have better employment prospects, better health care, better educational facilities. Think bright lights, big city, for sure. And they want to achieve a lifestyle that they see on their TV screens, that they see on advertisements all around their cities, a lifestyle that's as comfortable and consumptive as we enjoy here in the global north. And so there is a Jaguar dealership in Nairobi. This is an image from basically I took it outside the Nairobi Museum, National Museum. So the problem is, in moving to the cities, that achieving the African dream in urban Africa isn't particularly easy, right? The speed of urbanization has outpaced the ability of both the public and private sector to provide for residents. And it has really resulted in the phenomenon that most of us think of often when we think about the global south, which is the growth of slums, or what we used to more politely call informal settlements. So the UN has a very consistent definition about what constitutes a slum. It has to do with how durable the housing is, whether there's sufficient living space, whether it's overcrowded, whether you have access to safe and affordable water, where you have adequate sanitation, and whether you have security of tenure that stops you from being forcefully evicted. But we know, and a lot of my research has been really trying to differentiate between slums, we know that slums differ greatly from one to the next. Even within the same city, they can be very different. They differ across cities, and they certainly differ between countries. So some of the early research we did on this, for instance, compared Dakar to Nairobi to Johannesburg. Those places are vastly different when you think about what the urban living conditions are. So I'm going to now pivot toward infrastructure and talk a lot about an infrastructure survey that we did with the World Bank that was conducted in 2013. Conducted in 2014. While the data is a little old, this is a really precious data set. It cost us over $1 million to collect it because we went to 14,000 respondents in 15 different cities. So it's worth mining it, even though, admittedly, it's getting a little bit old. But just an aside before I go on, slums aren't the whole story. So the market in sub-Saharan African cities is working, and we have developers who are trying to create different types of housing. And what you see on this image is a photo taken in one of the very dense tenement neighborhoods in the city of Nairobi. So the structures you see here are what we call dormitories. They do offer better housing than slums, but they're not necessarily safe. So it's a dormitory because you got a single room. This is what old dormitories when I went to college looked like, right? A single room, and then you had the shared bathroom and everything down the hall with other people, shared kitchen. In the last decade, there's been a big spate of deadly building collapses, literally buildings just pancaking on top of people because contractors and developers are cutting corners in the quality of instruction. So in 2016, when I actually helped somebody write something to the Nairobi papers to try to decry this, the former governor of Nairobi estimated that there's 40,000 illegal and substandard structures within the city. So even if you think you've emerged from the slums and moved to something better, there's actually very life-threatening housing around you. So let's just briefly turn then to the urban deprivation side of this. So we did this survey of 14,000 households in 15 different cities. And what we did that was distinctive in this survey, because you see a lot of this right from the United Nations, that X percentage of the population doesn't have access to water and these kind of things. We wanted to look not just at the question of whether there's a water pipe there, but question of what actually comes out of the water pipe. So we created a measure that we called effective access. So that means that the infrastructure of the service had to be available, and it had to work most of the time. So kind of raising the bar and how we thought about what people were facing in their living conditions. So you'll see things here. I guess the one I always want to point out is that when it comes to toilets, one of our measures was the percentage of households with a non-public toilet facilities, shared or not. But if you shared it, you had to share it with fewer than 20 people. So we're not having extremely high standards, but 20 people sharing a toilet in an informal settlement is actually fairly good. So in terms of urban deprivation, these little guys have to come in. Okay, what I want to show you here, and this is where I'm first going to dwell on gray or hard infrastructure, and then I'm going to talk about climate change, the need to adapt, and what the possibilities are for gray and blue infrastructure as you move forward. But what you should take from this is that the cities that I study in Kenya are places of great urban deprivation. And that's all cities, not just the banner city that we hear about, which is Nairobi. What these radial graphs show to you are the effective aspects measures to infrastructure. And in this, we've broken the country up into the two largest cities, so Nairobi and Mombasa, the country's mid-sized cities, so it's mid-sized, the green one, which is Kisumu, Nakuru, and Eldoret, and then Ruck is what we call the rest of urban Kenya, so smaller cities. And again, effective access again means you have access to the infrastructure and it works most of the time. So what you see, just normatively, filled in is good, right? If you filled in and you're closer to the point, so notice phone, you have access to this infrastructure, you have access to this urban service. If it's very pulled back, look at water, you don't have access to piped, good quality water, or it's not there often. So just looking at this, you'll see the virtual absence of potable drinking water, toilets, sewerage, garbage collection, and street lights. These are all services provided by the state. What's the success story in Africa? It's the mobile phone. And the mobile phone is a success story because it's a private sector intervention. So if you live in a formal settlement, okay, the one to the right, access is better, but there are still major services missing. And if you look at, for instance, Mombasa, which is the second largest city in the country, it's the location of the major port, it's particularly poorly served. In this diagram of the data, I just want to let you know that essentially money makes a difference. So 9,000 Kenyan shillings is about $73 a month, and 30,000 is about $250 a month. So if you interpret these just to take a look at them, on the left-hand side, under 9,000 Kenyan shillings, the thing that should really jump out at you that even though you're poor, it's way better to be in Nairobi. If you're in Nairobi, capital city, there's a lot more investment that's taking place in infrastructure, so you get kind of the added benefit because it is the economic engine of the country. There's a big gap between Nairobi and Mombasa in terms of the colors that you see there. So Mombasa being the red that's really shrunk in, second largest city, port city, naval base, very underserved by infrastructure. But if you get more money, things look a lot better. What happens? The rich make up for governmental failure by self-provisioning. They dig boreholes, they invest in septic systems, they pay somebody to haul away their garbage. But even that's pretty illusory because in Nairobi, the garbage ends up in an open dump. There's not a single sanitary landfill in the entire country right now. They're all just open dumps. So gray infrastructure, I have to say, is incredibly important. I think if I had to do my training all over again, I might have actually gotten a civil engineering degree on top of my urban planning training. Human and solid waste fouls rivers, pollutes water sources, spreads debilitating diarrheal diseases. The lack of electricity isn't just inconvenient, which it often is for us, right, when we lose electricity. It lowers school performance for children. It forces families to rely on other sources of energy that compound problems of indoor air pollution and respiratory diseases, and it certainly undermines personal security and safety. The burden of self-provisioning, if you're poor, falls the hardest upon women and children, right? So all the classic things you think about in Africa, the most vulnerable members of society are the ones that are sent out to get water. They're the ones who end up walking very far to school. They have real difficulties finding a safe place to a toilet. So just a note I want to draw, though, in terms of parallel, and this gets us a little bit towards the green infrastructure question, is that the rich in Kenya, like the rich in the United States, have a built-in advantage or benefit relative to what we're trying to achieve with green infrastructure, especially in an age of climate change. They tend to live in greener, more canopy-filled places. They live in much lower densities. They have large parcels of land, and they're really better suited to combat some of the impacts of land use, and land cover change, like the rise of impervious surfaces or urban heat islands. It's not that different from America, and I hope some of you have seen that research done by Vivek Shandis that looks at essentially canopy cover in major cities. Richmond was one of the most publicized in terms of the New York Times, and he's showing that basically there's a correspondence between poor canopy, higher heat exposures and stress in certain neighborhoods, and those are the neighborhoods that we redlined, right, with the Homeowners Loan Corporation and with the sort of the banking system. So into this situation of urban deprivation, so poor services, lacking infrastructure, climate change has now entered, and it's making the situation worse. In February 2018, newspapers across the United States, actually across the globe, I think I read The Guardian the most, carried all these stories about the pending water crisis in Cape Town and the arrival of something called Day Zero. What was Day Zero? Day Zero was the day that Cape Town was going to run out of water. And due to the concerted efforts of millions of people and efforts at conservation, including, frankly, turning off taps, Cape Town managed to evade Day Zero for now. And as I was writing this, I thought, the next part I want to talk about Chennai, because Chennai is the very beautiful, colorful images. Well, Chennai was without water for 3 months. But then I thought, well, what about Jackson, Mississippi? Let's talk about American cities that can actually run out of water, right? We can have infrastructure that really, in a very unjust way, affects certain populations. So Chennai ran out of water several months. These sort of changes brought on by climate change are really affecting very vulnerable populations most. And what you see in both cities, and these are the other images there, is about flooding. So in 2015, Chennai had a very serious flood throughout the city. The floods in Cape Town are more limited, but they tend to hit the low-income townships. In both cases, they're hitting the most vulnerable populations. So what you have to understand is that in both cities, the reasons for the plight are many, right? Administrative incompetence, corruption, poor public utility management, poor urban planning. But one critical element that's making it all worse is climate change. So let me pivot now and talk about what's happening in climate change, and then the next pivot will be to talk about green infrastructure approaches. So in this presentation I'm going to show you, and hopefully you will see this, I'm going to express the need for more investment in infrastructure, but also the possibilities for green infrastructure investment. So these images show projections that come out of a lab of my former colleague, Deborah Lawrence, and she's with the Environmental Sciences program at UVA. She used remote sense longitudinal data and did a bunch of scenario modeling to look at business as usual scenarios, plus other scenarios premised on significant carbon reductions. And what she's doing that's relatively novel was she was adding in the element of population growth to calculate people exposure days to heat. So we know that climate change is going to have a largely deleterious impact upon Africa in general. Deborah predicts that extreme heat, so these are days above 39 degrees Celsius, so 102 degrees Fahrenheit, will grow much greater, much more frequent in East Africa, and including, of course, Kenya. So what I've got up here, I think, are two simple but relatively compelling graphics. So if you look at Kenya, and the image to the left will show you the two cities of Kisumu and Mombasa, she predicts that there's a range of 11 to 156 more extreme heat days a year within Kenya and the region. In Kisumu, the town that you see there, in 2010, it had about 10 extreme heat days, but it's estimated by 2085 that the range of extreme heat days will be anywhere from 80 to 100 days. So a third of the year, right, you might be facing degrees above 102 degrees. But to really understand this and think, well, what does this mean for public health? What does this mean for how we manage climate change? You have to understand the population projections. How many people are going to be impacted by this? So she uses here the business as usual climate projection to do the heat days. And then for those of you, I don't know if there's any modelers in the room, there's something called the Shared Socioeconomic Pathway 3 projections. They use that for understanding what population growth might be. And so in doing these two models, they made assumptions that there'd be little international tech transfer that would help them address climate change, that education would not be enough to affect certain types of changes, and they would not see regionalization in approaches that could help ameliorate issues associated with heat. So, and changes. So this, again, results in very high population growth in her assumptions. So the two cities here, again, Kisumu is to the west. It sits on Lake Victoria. Mombasa to the southeast. It's a major coastal city, port, naval base, second largest city of the country. Exposure is larger in Kisumu than in Mombasa at present, already millions of people days per year, right, because of the densities. In the future, though, both are going to experience very high exposures to heat. And so this is due to both climate change and population growth, but climate change is the larger driver of what's going to have the impact. So and she had a bunch of, I couldn't find her data on stormwater, unfortunately, in my files, but the heat is really significant because I think it has one of the biggest sort of evident discussions or evident linkages to thinking about landscape level interventions around climate change. So To achieve future climate change impacts, or to address, future climate change impacts like heat, and to foster urban resilience, we clearly need to think about cities and their residents holistically. We need to think about urban infrastructure, right? We need to think about urban services. So in the global south, like the global north, a role can be played by technology. And so I'm at a place now where if you don't use the word technology in like every third sentence, you are not considered a member of the tribe. So, okay, technology can make urban areas more resilient and more sustainable in the face of a changing climate. And so what you see here, for instance, solar panels for energy production, absolutely fabulous. Efficient cook stoves like pellet stoves, both of those together can address one very major concern, right, which is deforestation on the continent. And you can use materials. So the upper right is one of my favorite entrepreneurs in Kenya. She's using plastic water bottles and scrap plastic to create sort of these paving tiles that people are using for public infrastructure. If you want to be inspired about technology, you need to go to cleanleap.com and just sort of cruise around and see the cool things that are taking place. Why the reference? Well, just like Africa leapt over the landline, right, to go to the mobile phone, the idea here is that we can leap towards cleaner technologies and distributed systems, particularly for energy, electrification, water, and sanitation, that might make up for the fact that we haven't had the sewers or haven't had the sort of major infrastructure investment that we've had in the global north. So I have to give a little pro-Georgia Tech thing. One of my favorite leaps that we're seeing relates to the toilet. Now think about the toilet. Ridiculous amounts of water, right? I mean, crazy. So this is a tech fix from Tech. It's part of the Reinvent the Toilet Challenge, which I guess is Gates Foundation Challenge. My colleague, Professor Shannon Yee, and his research team have created a new toilet. There's 2 models of it. It uses far less water, and what it will do, it will convert feces into cakes, so those can be used for compost, or into ash. So both can be basically put into compost. They're about to field test it in South Africa and India, but what kind of drives me the most crazy is the way we're talking about it. So you all probably know that Thomas Crapper created the first toilet. So when people talk about going to the toilet and they use a word out of his name, that's kind of funny. Well, what they want everyone to do now with the Shannon Yee toilet is you're not going to go take you're going to go take a yee. Get it? All right, no peeing, we're going to be yeeing. I don't know. I think it's cool. I hope it takes off. And it's one of those things where technology can be great. But again, that kind of sophisticated technology, to make those cakes, you need to have electricity. It has to get up to 300-some degrees to bake it. It's not exactly something that's going to work in a slum where I don't actually have access to electricity. So what might we do in the spaces that I've been focused on? Well, one thing I see happening in sub-Saharan Africa, and you can think of this as sort of Wangari Maathai, right? Very important environmentalist out of Kenya, Greenbelt movement. Her sort of aspiration to green Kenya, to really think about protecting environment and natural resources, to reforestation, is an inspiration to Kenyans everywhere. And I think you see on different scales, different types of interventions that are taking place that are in some ways done by her heir apparents, okay? So creating the urban green, and this is a great one for designers, across cities in sub-Saharan Africa, planners, designers, community members, and activists are creating new green spaces out of what I would consider sort of liminal spaces. So even if they're not explicitly labeled green infrastructure, they certainly start to capture the benefits and recognize the potential of landscape-level interventions for managing and adapting to climate change. So in Kenya, and I haven't shown you many images except the one a few slides back, urban slums are very low rise. Right? And they're low tech. They're mud and wattle. They're dirt buildings with sort of corrugated iron roofs, and they're packed together, right? Maybe a single person space between a building, very high densities, even though they're not high rise. And so there's very little, if any, green space in most of the slums of Kenya. So this lack of open and green spaces, of course, is important in so many ways. Set aside heat islands, set aside those kind of questions. Families and children, right? Spaces for children to get out, places for sort of rest and relaxation and mental health. So recognizing this, KDI, which is I hope I say this right, Kui Design Initiative, so a series of architects and landscape architects, I think they actually all met at Harvard, They began working in Kibera in Nairobi to clean up and claim some marginal spaces. And they utilized participatory design processes. What they really did was they took the dump, the place everybody is dumping their garbage, dumping. One of the characteristics of Kibera is something they call flying toilets. What's a flying toilet? A flying toilet is it's too dangerous to go out at night. You have to go to the bathroom, you defecate into a bag, and you throw it out your window, right? So flying toilets, this whole space, they went in and they cleaned it up, right? And they've essentially reforested, they've put in ground cover, they've put in trees, and they've built, swings and things for children to play on. So their success has bred more success, and now several informal settlements across the city are working to replicate this cleanup, planting of trees, and building of playgrounds for recreation. So while not necessarily green infrastructure, it's a start to sort of the idea of the appreciation and what the benefits can be in spaces that are really devoid of green. A second area where one sees nascent consideration of landscape level interventions to green the city and address critical human needs is the urban agricultural movement in sub-Saharan Africa. And it really is a movement. I mean, there is so much interest in growing your own vegetables and creating and protecting heirloom crops. And it's really, in some ways, the cities, ironically, people are bringing in, seedlings and things from the rural area in order, in some ways, even safeguarding the seed crop in order to create gardens of their own for survival. So, given that many urban dwellers in places like the Global South, right, are first or second generation urbanists, there's really a very strong tradition of urban gardening. So like KDI's work, the previous example, the impetus isn't necessarily addressing infrastructure needs or mitigating climate change. Usually it's a desire for food security or for income. But the urban agriculture movement understands these co-benefits, and that's kind of funny to flip co-benefits the other way, but we're planting for food, but we know that we can actually have great cooling things happen if this fruit tree takes off. So agriculture is taking place stealthily at the urban fringe. It's happening in courtyards and within buildings, and again, back to those sort of liminal, these unclaimed spaces. Governments, by and large, are pretty hostile to wide-scale, broad-scale urban agriculture, but there are groups out there, Farm Africa is one of my favorites, that are really working to change that. And so these are two images of urban gardens in Kenya. The top one is actually Mombasa. The one project that I can really say, this is a very ambitious and interesting, large-scale project that's clearly focused on using landscape approaches to cool and decarbonize the atmosphere, is the ambitious Great Green Wall Initiative. So you see the image up there of where it's running. This has been conceived of initially, again, as an intervention to stop desertification, to stop the spread of in the Sahel. But the Great Green Wall is to run from Senegal and Mauritania in the west all the way over to Ethiopia and Djibouti in the east. So it's a distance of 8,000 kilometers. It's 15% complete. It's expected to cost some $2 billion to get it done. So of course, it's the big question mark is as to whether it will actually go all the way to completion. But the key species that they're using, the acacia, which is a fabulous tree, when planted in mass, can really create incredibly cooling and shading canopies. I used for a short period, I guess it was 3 years, I worked for WWF in Uganda, and we did a lot of agroforestry around national parks. And the acacia was one of our really critical species, particularly because these trees are excellent fodder. And if this region of Africa, it's heavily pastoralist, and so fodder that works for cattle, works for goats, is extremely important and appropriate. So let me talk then, those are my green infrastructure examples, about some of the challenges about moving these things forward. So I say there are distinct possibilities and really some important examples of green infrastructure. The key challenge that really is faced is how do you go to scale and how do you finance it? You'll notice I didn't give any encouraging examples about stormwater management. It's because I couldn't actually find any, which is, I went to the Center for African Cities is a great site at the University of Cape Town, and reading through their study of green infrastructure, nobody could sort of manage and talk about much about what we were able to do with stormwater. So to the right, I have a house in Portland, Oregon. You'll see Tanner Spring, right? Some of you probably know this. It's certainly a very inspiring example of, I think it's reconstructed, technically, wetland. It's been, it's using to capture and filter stormwater and manage flooding. The nature of rainfall in the Pacific Northwest, however, is basically drizzle, right? It rains a little all the time. It's vastly different from the torrential rains that we get in East Africa. So to the left, you see Mombasa in 2019. The rains that year displaced 18,000 people countrywide and destroyed some 16,000 homes. 31 of 47 counties, so think of that as states, were affected. So clearly, to deal with such a situation, we need a mixture of both gray and green, right, to really have effective management of water. There's a huge need, though, and there's really limited funds. So recognizing this, the African Union, the African Development Bank, I think it's the US Board of Trade and Export, something like that, Rockefeller Foundation, the French Development Agency, and some others have come together to create the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa. They are talking about $500 million to provide early stage project development capital. $500 million, it's really not a lot of money, but I guess it's a start. We'll see if and when and how this unfolds in order to improve this situation. So let me talk then, and I'm getting towards closing, about what sort of precursors I see for both gray and green infrastructure being implemented in a scale that we can address climate change and urban deprivation. So to address the inequities of rapid urbanization and this climate change compounding factor, we do need technical solutions, whether they're green, gray, or blue, but they're not the whole story, right? Because you have to implement them in a social fabric, in a political economy. You have to deal with the fact that there's humans involved with these technologies. So what we really need is still think about development, right? We still have to think about good old investment in education, so people understand climate change, they understand consequences, they understand what they're doing. We particularly need it for the girl child. I mean, females are major land managers in sub-Saharan Africa. Most small-scale agriculture is done by women. We need support for governance reform, so the person voting, democracy now more than ever, I would say, and there's been backsliding on democracy on the continent. And we need stronger legal institutions. I do say this, I have to say, as a person who teaches law classes, but we have to enhance accountability, we have to expose corruption, and we really have a fundamental issue of redistributing land and wealth in these countries. In Kenya, so you see the Ministry of Lands, it's kind of ironic, saying that their offices are corruption-free zones. In Kenya, a major obstacle to providing effective urban services and to develop gray and green infrastructure is that you've got really highly concentrated land ownership and really distorted property markets. You can't and won't build a decent house if you can't access land and know that you have secure tenure, right? Why build a house if they're going to knock it down? You can't plan better cities with better park systems, with more open space and tree canopy, if systems of land ownership and land administration are opaque and ineffective. You can't extend infrastructure if you can't basically find out a way to pay for it. So how do we pay for infrastructure in the United States? Property taxes, right? User fees. We need to be able to implement those. So I think I might have failed to say at the front end, but I think I did say that I'd heard a really cool thing about Athens that I thought, I've got to go see this thing. And so the local attraction that I heard about and wanted to see is the tree that owns itself. Okay, and I had never heard about this, and the guy who cuts my hair told me about it. I'm like, really? Cool. So for those of you who've studied land use and environmental law, you might know there's a very famous essay by a guy named Christopher Stone called Should Trees Have Standing? If you haven't read it, it's actually worth a read. And it essentially asks whether natural objects like trees should have legal rights, right? Since after all, we give corporations legal rights, right? Any of you who've watched Stephen Colbert, you can go on, corporations are people too, right? They're persons in any adjudicatory processes that we have. So this argument, whether trees should have standing in the court of law, was picked up by William O. Douglas in a very famous dissent in a case called Sierra Club versus Morton in 1972. And so that case essentially was a case where nature lost. Nature was being represented by the Sierra Club. And Disney won, and it was given the right to develop a ski resort in Mineral King Valley in Yosemite. They didn't actually build it, but put that aside. What this case did was it set a precedent about what you need to prove standing, right? And kind of a real interest that's affected, often ownership, is a perfect way to prove standing. So the fact that this tree in Athens has property rights, and these rights have been recognized by the courts, completely illustrates this argument. My understanding, and this is what I've read, is that it probably would have been cut down a long time ago, and in fact it fell over and then the little son of whatever tree came up. It was protected because it had property rights. Rights matter, right? So if you have a right, or rights matter. You must have the right, you must have standing to defend your interests. You know, why would I plant a tree? Why would I build a green building? Why would I invest my labor and capital if the state can take away my right and take away my land? So when we think about infrastructure, particularly green infrastructure, it's a land-based thing. And you've got to understand, can we control the land? You know, do we have the right to do these things that we want to do? So the lack of secure and codified land rights in Africa is a major obstacle for effective development of green infrastructure and other land-based natural solutions to climate change. You know, land, while it's valuable in any society, and I think most of my wealth is definitely tied up in property, but it is the most valuable asset in African society. It is the primary vehicle for wealth building. You don't have a Wall Street the same way we do. It is virtually synonymous with power. And it is extremely inequitably distributed. It is estimated that the 3 last presidents' families own something like 60% of the land base, the arable land base in the country of Kenya. So big, dominant families. Think latifundia if you think of Latin America. So a small and very powerful elite uses the tools of the state, the bureaucracy, the judiciary, and the police to steal land. So I'm showing you 2 images of this. To the left are school children at the Langata Primary School who arrived at school to find that their playground had been fenced off and padlocked. They looked inside, what had happened, there's bulldozers in there, the trees had been cut, they had started to clear the land because somebody was going to develop it. It was their playground, and over the weekend somebody came in to grab it. They protested, and they got quite sophisticated, got lots of international attention, and they were subsequently tear gassed by the police. To the right, you see 2 activists from a group called GROOTS, and this is a women's organization that's using tablets and open source software, open map sort of thing, to demarcate the public land associated with their children's schools so that sort of existing public land doesn't once again get stolen by people who have access to the reins of power in the state to take this away. So a really fantastic project. They actually have been flown to the United States to go. There's a great World Bank land conference if you are interested in land issues. But mapping, I think mapping is very powerful. Mapping allows one to assert one's right to space, what we would call one right to the city in planning. And through this mapping process, we're seeing communities start to demand that the state pay attention to them and bring in much needed infrastructure and services. So the best case of this is what I'm showing here. It's had a little bit of management problems subsequently, but this is called the MAP Kibera project. So you can imagine, I've talked about Kibera multiple times. Kibera is this very large slum you see on the right-hand side in Nairobi. It's home to literally hundreds of thousands of people, and they live north and south of that red line, which is the train track that runs through the middle of the settlement. When I lived in Nairobi in the 1990s, it was never on an official city map. All we would refer to it was as Nairobi Dam. So it was like this blank spot in which hundreds of thousands of people lived. They had no property rights, no legal recognition from the state, virtually nothing in the way of services being provided to them. So by using open maps with cell phones and community inputs, activists associated with Map Kibera have demanded and obtained attention from the state. Their first request, gray infrastructure projects. We want toilets. We want sewerage, right? We want the sort of things that help us live healthy lives. So this is also then the location of that KDI playground that I laid out saying it's like let's call it proto-green infrastructure. This is the space, these kind of neighborhoods are where green infrastructure, green spaces, environmental improvements are much desired. They're much needed, and they're now being demanded. So to close this sort of circuitous route from urbanization, gray infrastructure, climate change, green infrastructure possibilities, and property rights, you might be saying, well, okay, what's the takeaway from this talk, lady? What's the conclusion? So I think that as we face climate change, there's a dire need for diverse and complementary approaches to infrastructure provision, particularly for cities like these in the global south. We need all types of infrastructure, right? We need green, we need blue, we need gray, right? We need to make things change because people literally are suffering. Urban living conditions are really terrible. But to obtain the benefits of infrastructure, to facilitate the spread of, say, gray to green, we shouldn't be naive, right? We need to know, well, I should say this. We've known for a long time what we need to do about climate change. It always kills me when somebody says, we had no idea. It's like, really? We had an idea. In the 1980s, we had ideas what was going to happen. We've known for a long time we need to address carbon and prepare for change. Yet we really have done woefully little. And unfortunately, I think this is the other side about this project, this topic that bothers me the most. We're going to take so many species down with us with climate change. And having lived in sub-Saharan Africa and watched elephants and watched giraffes and thinking, they might disappear in my lifetime? How can this possibly be? My God. So to be effective designers, engineers, planners, and architects, we can't simply rely on the beauty of our designs or the evidence of our impact from our research. We need to be really socially and politically savvy. We need to understand the obstacles and opportunities that are out there. We need to understand institutional frameworks, right? We need to understand politics. We need to understand the communities in which we work, and we need to be really effective in communication so that we can facilitate change. So we need to become activists, unabashed activists. Embrace it. That's what you need to do. So it's a bit overused, but to this day, I love Margaret Mead's quote, and it actually makes me sort of choke up. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Thank you.